Beneath the golden rays of the Egyptian sun, where the vast deserts meet the life-giving Nile, there lies a civilization that has captivated the world for centuries. Ancient Egypt, with its towering pyramids, majestic temples, and intricate hieroglyphs, speaks to us across time, whispering tales of mystery, power, and grandeur. Yet, behind these awe-inspiring structures, there is a quieter, lesser-known story, one that has long been overlooked. It is the story of the women who, despite the silence cast over them by history, held immense power and influence in one of the most sophisticated and enduring civilizations the world has ever known. While much of Egypt's glory has been attributed to its male rulers, the pharaohs and generals whose names echo through the corridors of time, the women of ancient Egypt were far from mere bystanders. In a society structured by rigid hierarchies and defined roles, women were both subjects and sovereigns in their own right, playing essential roles that were often obscured by the grand narratives of history. It is easy to forget that the power of Egypt's leaders was not always solely in the hands of men. The very foundations of Egyptian society were built not only on the shoulders of mighty kings, but also on the quiet, steady strength of women. Women, in their various roles as daughters, wives, mothers, priestesses, and even rulers, navigated a world where they were both revered and restricted. At the heart of this ancient civilization was a strict societal structure, where gender roles were clearly defined, yet fluid enough for women to wield significant influence. This was not a world of total submission, but one in which women, despite facing immense societal pressures, were capable of shaping the course of Egypt's history. Their lives, though not always recorded in the way their male counterparts were, tell us a different side of the story, one filled with complexity, resilience, and quiet rebellion. Women were the keepers of lineage, culture, and religion. They were the silent architects behind the great pharaohs, often instrumental in the spiritual, political, and familial affairs that sustained the kingdom. Though often relegated to the shadows of history, their contributions were undeniably crucial to the flourishing of Egyptian society. Yet, despite their importance, these women's roles were often downplayed or misunderstood. The complexities of their lives have been drowned out by the louder, more dominant voices of kings and military heroes. The truth is that, while their stories were frequently overshadowed, their power was not just confined to the home or the temple. It reached far beyond, extending into the political and religious arenas that governed Egypt. This, however, is a side of Egypt that is seldom explored. And so, we begin to uncover a reality that contrasts sharply with the popular image of ancient Egypt. A world where women were not mere spectators, but rather crucial participants in the weaving of a great civilization. What was their true role? How did they influence the politics of the day? What does their story tell us about the complexity of power, the fluidity of gender roles, and the often hidden strength that shaped Egypt's past? These are the questions we will seek to answer as we uncover the untold stories of the women of ancient Egypt. From the royal courts to the temples, from the homes of commoners to the halls of power, women in ancient Egypt were more than we've been led to believe. In the next chapters, we will delve deeper into their lives, uncovering the hidden facets of their contributions and the challenges they faced, setting the stage for a journey through one of history's most fascinating and often misunderstood civilizations. Ancient Egypt was a land defined by a rigid social order, where every individual had a place in a vast and intricate system of hierarchy. At the top stood the pharaoh, the divine ruler whose word was law, followed by a series of officials, priests, soldiers, and workers. Below this ruling elite, society was divided into clear categories, from the nobility to the common people, and the roles of men and women were similarly delineated, often with starkly different expectations for each. Women, despite the constraints of these societal structures, were not merely subordinate. Their roles were integral to the stability and function of this ancient civilization. The system that governed ancient Egyptian society was both hierarchical and deeply rooted in tradition. From the moment a child was born, their place in society was determined by their gender, birth status, and the family into which they were born. The men, as the primary breadwinners and warriors, were expected to protect, provide, and uphold the political and military power of the nation. Meanwhile, women's roles were often more private, focused on the home, the family, and the temple. However, the influence they wielded in these spaces was far from passive. In the household, women were the heart and soul of daily life. They were not only responsible for raising children and managing the home, but they also played crucial roles in the economic stability of the family. Many women, especially in rural areas, contributed to farming and the production of goods, working alongside their husbands or even leading businesses. The fact that their work was often unrecorded or underrepresented in historical accounts should not diminish its significance. In truth, without their labor, the foundations of society would have crumbled. The homes were not merely centers of domesticity, they were the microcosms of Egypt's larger social and economic order. Women's roles extended far beyond the home, however. Religion, the core of Egyptian life, provided women with a different avenue for influence. Ancient Egypt's pantheon of gods and goddesses included many powerful female figures, such as Isis, Hathor, and Ma'at. These deities were not only worshipped for their beauty or maternal roles, but were also seen as embodiments of justice, wisdom, and cosmic order. The role of priestesses was incredibly important, as they served as the earthly intermediaries between the gods and the people. Women in these religious positions were highly respected, often holding immense power within their communities. The temples, the sanctuaries of the gods, were also the sanctuaries of women who could wield spiritual authority, creating a space where their influence could be felt, even if their names were not always recorded in the annals of history. Priestesses, while often overshadowed by the male priests who dominated the higher echelons of Egyptian religion, played a vital role in maintaining Egypt's spiritual equilibrium. They were in charge of temple rituals, managing offerings to the gods, and ensuring the daily rituals that were believed to keep chaos at bay. In a society that believed the stability of the cosmos hinged on these rituals, the priestesses were integral to maintaining that stability. While their contributions were not always celebrated with the grandeur reserved for their male counterparts, these women were the unseen forces who held the spiritual power of Egypt in their hands. But it was not just in religion that women found ways to exercise influence. In the political sphere, though women were often excluded from formal leadership roles, they still managed to assert considerable power. Queens, for instance, were not just the wives of pharaohs. They were often co-rulers, regents, or advisors who helped steer the course of Egypt's political destiny. The role of a queen could extend far beyond that of a ceremonial figurehead. Some, like the famous Cleopatra and the lesser-known but equally powerful Hatshepsut, defied convention and took on leadership roles, ruling Egypt as pharaohs in their own right. Their reigns were marked by significant military campaigns, architectural feats, and political alliances that shaped the course of Egyptian history. The power of these women, however, was not always as overt as that of their male counterparts. Queens and princesses often worked behind the scenes, influencing decisions and policies through their roles as wives, mothers, or advisors. They were the gatekeepers of Egypt's political alliances, with marriage and familial connections being key to Egypt's international diplomacy. While their official titles may have been secondary to those of the men around them, the behind-the-scenes work they did was critical to Egypt's enduring strength. Even beyond the elite, everyday women in ancient Egypt could hold considerable influence. As mothers, they were tasked with the continuation of the family, ensuring the passing down of Egyptian culture and religion. In a society that valued lineage and the connection to the gods, a woman's role as the mother of future generations was sacred. They were seen as the guardians of Egypt's future, tasked not only with raising children but with shaping the next generation of citizens who would carry on Egypt's grand traditions. Yet, despite these important roles, the reality of life for most women was still constrained by the societal norms of ancient Egypt. Gender roles were strict, and while women had a significant degree of autonomy within the domestic and religious spheres, their opportunities for social mobility were limited. Unlike the men who could ascend to positions of power based on their military or administrative skills, women were generally confined to roles defined by their relationships to men as wives, mothers, and daughters. They could not directly engage in the political, military, or legal decisions that shaped Egypt's governance, and they had few legal rights compared to men. However, the lives of women in ancient Egypt were not purely defined by their limitations. There existed a profound complexity within these roles, a duality of power and constraint. Women in Egypt did not simply accept their place in society. They often found ways to bend or navigate the rigid structures that sought to confine them. They used their roles in religion, the family, and the political sphere to assert influence, demonstrating that even in a society with clearly defined gender roles, women could find pathways to power and agency. As we move deeper into the story of women in ancient Egypt, we will see how these roles evolved and how some women managed to shatter the expectations that sought to keep them in the shadows. Their stories, often quiet and overlooked, reveal a civilization far more complex than it may initially appear. The contrast between what we are told about ancient Egypt and the hidden realities of women's lives is vast, and as we uncover these truths, the ancient world will become more nuanced, more alive, and far more mysterious than we ever imagined. The next chapters will explore the specific ways in which women's power manifested itself in the realms of politics, religion, and daily life, setting the stage for the discovery of how these women navigated their worlds, carving out spaces of influence that continue to echo through history. The journey is only beginning, and as we go deeper into the lives of these women, we will see just how central they were to the survival and prosperity of ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, a society structured around both divine order and earthly power, women played roles that were often both essential and quietly commanding. They were the silent architects of the nation's continuity, ensuring that Egypt's core values, its faith, its lineage, and its cultural traditions were passed down through generations. While much of Egypt's grand history is defined by the pharaohs and the military conquests of men, the true lifeblood of this civilization often flowed through the homes, hearts, and hands of the women who kept its foundations steady. The roles of women in ancient Egypt were many and varied, but at their core, they could be classified as wives, mothers, daughters, and priestesses. These roles were not mere social expectations. They were the building blocks of Egyptian society. As wives, women were the partners of the pharaohs, the elite officials, and the common laborers alike. While many aspects of marriage were dictated by practicality, particularly in the elite, where political alliances were often sealed through matrimony, there existed a deep spiritual and emotional bond between husbands and wives, especially in the private spheres. Women in Egypt, regardless of their status, were considered the heart of the home, responsible for managing households, raising children, and maintaining the moral and spiritual fabric of society. Yet, their influence was not confined to the home. Women's roles as mothers were revered as sacred, for it was through them that Egypt's legacy continued. A mother's ability to produce heirs was not just a biological function, but a deeply political one. In the royal family, the pharaoh's power was inextricably linked to the succession of the throne, and thus, the mother of a prince or princess was often seen as the key to maintaining Egypt's dynastic stability. The royal family's power rested in the ability of women to produce strong, capable heirs who would uphold the throne and ensure Egypt's place as a dominant force in the ancient world. In many ways, the role of a woman as a mother and wife was intertwined with that of a caregiver and teacher. She was responsible not only for the physical upbringing of the next generation, but also for imparting Egypt's vast knowledge, its religion, its culture, and its traditions. Women in ancient Egypt were the bearers of culture, the transmitters of faith, and the nurturers of identity. Even in the most humble households, the mother was the first teacher, imparting wisdom through stories, rituals, and the unspoken values that shaped her children's view of the world. Beyond their familial roles, women also had a profound presence in the spiritual and religious life of Egypt. The role of priestess, though not as visible as the male priesthood, was a critical function in Egyptian society. Women who served in temples and religious ceremonies held sway in the spiritual realm of Egypt, and their duties extended far beyond what was typically recognized in public histories. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, often responsible for the daily rituals that maintained the balance of the universe. The priestess's role was one of power, a quiet yet undeniable influence that extended into both the public and the private realms. In temples dedicated to gods like Isis and Hathor, women were charged with ensuring that the deities were honored, their blessings invoked, and their favor maintained. They worked as intermediaries between the gods and the people, performing rituals, making offerings, and often conducting the ceremonies that were believed to uphold Ma'at, the cosmic order that ensured peace and prosperity in Egypt. In these roles, women were not simply subordinates to the male priesthood. In fact, the female priestesses had significant autonomy in spiritual matters. They were often the ones who managed the temple's wealth, controlled land holdings, and provided spiritual guidance. The priestesses were not only revered figures within the religious community, but also held power in the courts of the gods. In a society that placed such immense importance on religion and divine favor, women who held these positions were integral to the very survival of the state. Though their names may not always have been preserved in the same way as their male counterparts, women's influence in both the private and public spheres of ancient Egyptian life was undeniably powerful. The home was their domain, and within its walls, they managed the household's financial and emotional affairs. They raised children who would one day lead Egypt, taught the traditions of the land, and kept the faith of the people alive. But their influence did not stop at the doorstep. Whether through their roles as mothers of the royal family or as priestesses in the temples, women held sway in the corridors of power, albeit in ways that were often less visible, yet equally as crucial to the maintenance of order and stability in Egypt. Women in ancient Egypt were integral to the success and continuity of the society, although their contributions were often overshadowed by their male counterparts in the historical narrative. As the caretakers of Egypt's spiritual, familial, and cultural legacy, they were the backbone of society, responsible for ensuring the stability of the kingdom and the survival of its traditions. Their work, often done quietly, behind closed doors, was fundamental to the very fabric of the Egyptian world. The power of these women, though largely unseen, was pervasive, stretching from the royal courts to the homes of the commoners, from the grand temples to the humble villages, and from the hearts of the family to the will of the state. It is easy to dismiss these roles as merely domestic, but that would be a grave misjudgment. The women of ancient Egypt were the silent forces who upheld the pillars of their society, ensuring that Egypt's grandeur was not just built on the backs of kings and warriors, but on the very lives of those who nurtured, protected, and passed down the civilization's most sacred traditions. As we continue our exploration of women in ancient Egypt, the focus will shift to the role of religion, where women were not just passive worshippers, but active participants in the maintenance of Egypt's spiritual order. In temples, they wielded power, though quietly, and in doing so, they shaped not only the spiritual life of Egypt, but its political structure as well. This delicate balance between spiritual and familial duty will lead us into the next chapter, where we will explore the intersection of women's roles in religion and their influence on the broader Egyptian society. Their sacred duties, often unseen by the public eye, were essential to Egypt's survival both on earth and in the afterlife. In the heart of ancient Egypt, where every moment of life was intertwined with the divine, women held a position that many may find surprising. While much of history has focused on the powerful male figures who constructed Egypt's monuments, waged wars, and ruled as pharaohs, women in ancient Egypt were not just passive figures. They were active participants in the spiritual life of their society, wielding influence not only as worshippers, but as powerful vessels of divine energy, serving as the vital links between the gods and the people. Their role as priestesses and goddesses, often hidden beneath layers of history, was far more influential than we have traditionally understood. Religion was the bedrock of Egyptian civilization. Every aspect of daily life, from the rising and setting of the sun to the fate of souls in the afterlife, was governed by the gods. The Egyptians believed that the gods themselves walked among them, interacting with the living world, shaping fate, and ensuring order in the universe. In such a society, spiritual power was not confined to the men who ruled the land. Women, too, were given the sacred responsibility of maintaining the cosmic balance, often acting as intermediaries between the gods and humans. Priestesses in ancient Egypt held a unique and powerful place within the temples. Unlike the male priests who often controlled the high offices and administrative duties, female priestesses were closely tied to the daily rituals that maintained Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. These rituals were of immense importance, for they were believed to keep chaos at bay, ensuring that the natural world remained in harmony. While the public rituals were often presided over by male priests, the women were indispensable in the private rites, the intimate, sacred ceremonies that took place behind the temple's walls. It was through these women that divine power flowed into the material world, shaping the lives of everyday Egyptians. The responsibilities of the priestesses were vast. They were entrusted with the care of the temple's sacred statues, performing offerings to the gods, and maintaining the cleanliness and sanctity of the temple grounds. In some cases, they even played a role in divine prophecy, using their perceived connection to the gods to interpret omens and dreams. But their roles were not confined to the temple's boundaries. The influence of a priestess extended beyond religious duties, as they often managed vast wealth, land, and estates, further cementing their power in the society. The temples themselves were not just religious centers, they were economic hubs, and the priestesses wielded substantial authority within these institutions. Though their religious power was significant, women's role as goddesses was arguably even more central to the functioning of Egyptian religion. The Egyptian pantheon was rich with powerful female deities, each embodying essential elements of life, death, and the afterlife. Perhaps the most well-known of these goddesses is Isis, the goddess of magic, healing, and motherhood, whose role as protector and savior transcended the mortal world. Isis was revered not just as a deity, but as a figure who embodied the strength, resilience, and nurturing qualities that women in ancient Egypt were expected to uphold. She was often depicted as the ideal mother, wife, and protector, reinforcing the spiritual power that women held in the domestic and public spheres. But Isis was far from the only powerful goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, was another key figure who symbolized the nurturing, protective, and life-giving aspects of womanhood. Hathor's role was central to both the spiritual and earthly domains. Her influence reached from the home to the grand temples, where she was invoked during major ceremonies. In a society that valued fertility and the continuation of the family line, Hathor's importance as a goddess was paramount. Her power felt in both the rituals of marriage and the worship of the natural world. In addition to these well-known deities, Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, was another central figure. As the embodiment of divine law, Ma'at played a critical role in Egyptian society, and women were often the ones to personify her in religious practices. Women, as the caretakers of Ma'at, were seen as the ones who upheld not just social order, but the very balance of the cosmos. To be a woman in ancient Egypt was to carry the weight of ensuring that Ma'at was maintained through personal conduct, religious observance, and the bearing of children who would continue the divine order. It was not simply a spiritual role, it was a cosmic duty, one that connected women directly to the very forces that governed the world. The intertwining of women's lives with the divine was not just a metaphor, it was a practical, everyday reality for those who served in the temples and for the royal women who were seen as earthly embodiments of the gods. The queen, for example, was often depicted as the consort of the god Amun-Ra, embodying the divine feminine power that ruled alongside the male pharaoh. Through her ceremonial marriage to the god, the queen was seen as an intermediary, her role vital to the renewal of cosmic harmony. In this way, the queens of Egypt were both political and spiritual figures, their power extending beyond the court to the very heavens. Even in the private lives of Egyptian women, religion was a constant presence. The homes were filled with shrines, amulets, and figurines of the gods, and women were expected to participate in daily rituals that honored the divine. The private and the public worlds of women were inseparable. their devotion to the gods permeated all aspects of life. A woman's role as a caretaker and mother was not merely about raising children, but about instilling in them a deep respect for the gods and their place in the divine order. In these roles, women were not simply passive vessels of divine will, they were active participants in the creation and maintenance of Egypt's spiritual strength. The priestesses and goddesses were the conduits through which divine power flowed, shaping not only the lives of individuals but the fate of the entire civilization. The divine energy they channeled was not just a ceremonial gesture, it was believed to have tangible effects on the prosperity and longevity of Egypt itself. Without their influence, the gods would not have been honored, and the natural world would have fallen into chaos. As we shift our focus to the next chapter, we will delve deeper into how the spiritual power of these women transcended their religious duties and intertwined with political life. The roles of the queens and royal women in Egypt were not just symbolic, they were central to the functioning of the state. In the next chapter, we will explore the dynastic importance of women, especially in the royal family, and how their spiritual and political influence left an indelible mark on Egypt's history. The history of ancient Egypt is often told through the triumphs of its male pharaohs, warriors, conquerors, and god-kings who built pyramids and commanded vast armies. But woven into this narrative, often lost or overshadowed by the grand titles of men, are the powerful women who sat at the throne or stood beside the kings. These queens were more than just ceremonial figures, they were rulers in their own right, shaping the fate of Egypt through their intelligence, political strategy, and, at times, military prowess. Perhaps the most famous of these women is Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. Her name has long been synonymous with beauty and seduction, often reduced to the romanticized image of a queen who used her allure to win the favor of powerful men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But this is only part of her story. The reality is far more complex and compelling. Cleopatra was not merely a pawn in a political game, she was a shrewd and capable leader who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics with unmatched skill. Her reign was marked by savvy alliances, deft diplomacy, and the use of political power to secure Egypt's independence from the growing might of Rome. Cleopatra understood that her survival as a ruler in a male-dominated world depended on her ability to master the art of politics, and she did so with unparalleled cunning. She was a queen who understood the power of perception and the subtleties of statecraft, positioning herself as both a political ally and a lover to the most powerful men in the Mediterranean world. Yet, it was her intellect and leadership that made her one of the most formidable figures in Egyptian history. Cleopatra's reign was one of the last moments of independence for Egypt before it fell under Roman control. But even as Egypt's political landscape shifted, Cleopatra remained a symbol of Egyptian power and culture. She carefully cultivated her image, positioning herself not only as the Queen of Egypt, but also as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, a divine protector of Egypt. Through this symbolism, Cleopatra fused her political authority with divine legitimacy, a strategy used by many Egyptian rulers throughout history. It wasn't her beauty alone that made Cleopatra a legend, it was her astute governance and ability to wield her power in a world dominated by men. Cleopatra's legacy is a testament to the complexity of power, where beauty, intellect, and political strategy were intertwined, each element feeding the other to maintain her grip on Egypt. Another queen whose power was undeniable was Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs. Hatshepsut's reign stands as one of the most remarkable in Egyptian history, not just because of her political achievements, but also because of the extraordinary circumstances that led to her ascent to power. As the wife of Pharaoh Thutmose II and the stepmother of Thutmose III, Hatshepsut was initially expected to play a passive role. But when her husband died and her stepson was too young to rule, she made a bold decision. She took the throne for herself. What followed was a reign marked by peace, prosperity, and monumental construction projects. Hatshepsut's most famous legacy is the magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari, an architectural wonder that still stands today as a testament to her grandeur and vision. However, her decision to take power was not without its challenges. As a woman in a male-dominated society, Hatshepsut had to navigate the delicate balance of asserting her authority while maintaining legitimacy. She adopted the full titulary of the pharaoh, even presenting herself as a male figure in some depictions, wearing the traditional beard and royal regalia. This decision was not only a political move but also a symbolic one, signaling her divine right to rule despite her gender. Hatshepsut's reign was one of innovation, diplomacy, and economic prosperity, yet her achievements were often overshadowed by the later reign of her stepson Thutmose III, who, after her death, sought to erase her from history. Despite this, Hatshepsut's legacy endured, and her reign is now recognized as one of the most successful in Egypt's history. Nefertiti, another iconic queen, is often remembered for her stunning beauty, immortalized in the famous bust found in Amarna. But Nefertiti was more than just a figure of aesthetic admiration. As the wife of the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten, Nefertiti played a central role in one of the most radical shifts in Egyptian religious and cultural history. Akhenaten's reign was marked by the establishment of the Aten as the sole god, rejecting the traditional pantheon of gods that had defined Egypt for centuries. Nefertiti, as his queen, was not merely a passive figure by his side. She was an active participant in his religious reforms. In many depictions, she is shown alongside Akhenaten, performing rituals and making offerings to the Aten, sometimes in scenes where she takes on a role typically reserved for a male pharaoh. This visual representation hints at her involvement in the religious and political upheaval that defined the Amarna period. Although Nefertiti's later years remain shrouded in mystery, it's clear that she was more than just a queen consort. Some theories even suggest that after Akhenaten's death, she may have briefly ruled Egypt as pharaoh, perhaps under the name Smenkhkare, though this remains speculative. What is undeniable is her influence during her lifetime, not only as a wife and mother, but also as a co-ruler in a period of profound change. Like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut, Nefertiti's reign shows that women in ancient Egypt could wield power in extraordinary ways, shaping both the spiritual and political landscapes of their time. Each of these queens, Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti, faced unique challenges as women in a patriarchal society, yet they navigated these obstacles with strength, intelligence, and determination. They were not simply the wives or daughters of powerful men, they were rulers in their own right, each one leaving an indelible mark on the history of Egypt. Their reigns were characterized by political acumen, bold decisions, and the ability to challenge the traditional boundaries of gender and power. In a world where male rulers dominated the stage, these queens found ways to assert their authority, ensuring that their influence was felt long after their reigns ended. What emerges from the stories of these queens is a picture of women who were not confined to the roles history often assigns them. They were warriors of a different kind, intellectual, strategic, and fiercely determined. Their power lay not only in their royal bloodlines or their relationships with men, but in their ability to navigate, manipulate, and reshape the political and spiritual worlds around them. They prove that women, even in the ancient world, were not just passive figures in the background. They were the architects of their own destinies, shaping the course of history with every decision they made. This section of our journey into the lives of Egypt's royal women sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the inner workings of power and politics in the royal court. We will look at how these queens navigated the delicate balance between maintaining power and managing their dynastic obligations in a world dominated by men. The political landscape they inhabited was one fraught with competition, betrayal, and intrigue, yet it was also one where they shaped the course of Egypt's destiny. The struggle for power in the royal court was never a simple one, and in the next chapter we will dive deeper into the dynamics of royal power, uncovering the challenges these women faced as they carved out their places in Egypt's history. Behind every powerful queen of ancient Egypt, there was not just a throne waiting for her, but an endless battle to maintain her authority in a world where that power was always in question. The journey to power for royal women in Egypt was not just about inheritance or divine right. It was a continuous negotiation between their gender, their lineage, and the expectations of a society that often viewed women's political authority with skepticism. While these queens were revered as powerful figures, their reigns were marked by complex struggles that tested the boundaries of their leadership. What price did these women pay for their power? One of the most significant obstacles these queens faced was the delicate balancing act between their personal identity and their political identity. In a male-dominated world, royal women were often forced to navigate the treacherous waters of political alliances, marriages, and family dynamics. Their very legitimacy as rulers was frequently challenged by those around them, and their authority was often seen as secondary to that of the male pharaohs who ruled before or after them. This was a world where women had to prove themselves capable leaders, all while contending with the expectations placed on them by their gender. Marriage played a central role in this balancing act. In ancient Egypt, marriage was not merely a personal or romantic union, it was a political tool. Queens were often married to pharaohs to solidify political alliances, and their marriages were seen as pivotal in the shaping of Egypt's political and military power. For example, Cleopatra's alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just personal, they were strategic moves designed to safeguard Egypt's independence. These alliances were pivotal in maintaining Egypt's standing in the Mediterranean world, yet they also brought about immense challenges. Cleopatra's relationship with Antony, for instance, came at great personal and political cost. The union led to her political entanglement in Rome's civil wars, contributing to Egypt's eventual downfall. Yet, despite the high stakes, Cleopatra continued to wield her influence, using her marriage and alliances to maintain her position as Egypt's queen, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. In addition to marriage, inheritance was another thorny issue for royal women. While women in ancient Egypt could inherit property, titles, and even rule as queens, their inheritance rights were frequently contested. This often led to political instability within the royal family, as male relatives or rivals sought to challenge or undermine the queen's authority. Hatshepsut's rise to power is a prime example. After the death of her husband, Thutmose II, Hatshepsut was initially intended to act as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But instead of simply playing a supportive role, she seized the throne for herself. Her decision to adopt the full regalia of a male pharaoh and assume the title of king was a bold, unprecedented move. Hatshepsut's reign, which lasted over 2 decades, brought prosperity and stability to Egypt, yet her ascent to power was far from smooth. Her stepson, Thutmose III, who later succeeded her, attempted to erase her from history, defacing her monuments and removing her name from official records. This act of political erasure was likely motivated by the fact that Hatshepsut, a woman, had usurped the throne. Despite her accomplishments, the stigma of being a woman in power remained a constant threat to her legacy. The challenge of ruling as a woman in a male-dominated society also meant that queens had to be exceptionally strategic in how they exercised their power. Their authority, though immense, was often fragile, and they could not afford to display weakness or indecision. They were expected to embody both the nurturing, maternal qualities associated with femininity and the strength and decisiveness expected of rulers. This dual expectation could be exhausting and limiting. In some cases, queens were forced to present themselves in ways that were not entirely true to their personal identities, often blurring the lines between their public and private selves. The famous image of Hatshepsut, for example, is often that of a male pharaoh with the false beard and traditional royal garb, a visual representation of her need to assert her power in a world that could not easily accept a female ruler. Moreover, queens were not just rulers in the royal court, they were also symbols of Egypt's unity and divine favor. The political alliances they forged, often through marriage, were not just for the benefit of their households, they were symbols of Egypt's strength and its relationship with other powerful nations. These alliances were part of a broader strategy to maintain Egypt's influence over neighboring kingdoms and protect it from external threats. In many cases, queens were the figureheads of diplomacy, representing Egypt in negotiations and treaties, and their marriages were often a means of ensuring peace or securing trade routes. But this also meant that queens, like Cleopatra, often found themselves in precarious positions, as their personal and political lives were deeply intertwined with Egypt's foreign relations. Every decision they made had the potential to alter Egypt's standing in the world, and failure could lead to swift and harsh consequences. While queens were often the faces of Egypt's power, they were also symbols of its vulnerability. Their power was always at risk, threatened by rivals, both within and outside the court. Even Cleopatra, who wielded immense political power and military influence, found herself ensnared by the political tides of Rome, where her alliances with Caesar and Antony made her a target for the Roman elite. Her position was never secure, and her reign ultimately came to an end with Egypt's annexation by Rome. The challenges these queens faced were not just external, they were deeply personal, involving family dynamics, rivalries, and the constant threat of betrayal. Queens like Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut had to navigate these emotional and political mazes while ensuring that Egypt's interests were always placed first. For many of these women, ruling was not just about wielding power, it was about maintaining a delicate balance of politics, gender, and family, where one misstep could cost them everything. Behind every powerful queen of ancient Egypt was not just a throne, but the constant pressure to prove herself in a world where her authority was never fully accepted. These queens, though legendary, faced obstacles that went far beyond what most of us can imagine. They were forced to walk a fine line between asserting their power and conforming to the expectations of a patriarchal society. Their struggles were not just political but personal, as they grappled with their identity as women in positions of extraordinary authority. And yet, despite the challenges, their legacies have endured. Their stories remain a testament to the resilience, intelligence, and sheer will of women who rose to power, changed the course of history, and left a lasting impact on the world. As we move forward into the next chapter, we will explore the hidden dangers and limitations these royal women faced, everything from betrayal to the pressures of public perception, and how they managed these challenges. Their lives were filled with complexities, and it is through these hidden dangers that we see how they navigated the treacherous waters of power in a world that often sought to undermine them. Their stories, though fraught with adversity, are ones of perseverance, power, and enduring influence. The glittering jewels of a queen's crown may have shone brightly, but they could not conceal the shadow that followed her, one cast by the political rivals, jealous courtiers, and scheming family members who were ready to strip away her power the moment she became expendable. The dangers faced by royal women in ancient Egypt were not always visible, but they were real, and they were deadly. Beneath the surface of regal appearances and divine authority, these women lived with the constant threat of betrayal, political assassination, and the erosion of the power they so carefully built. For queens like Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut, the public adoration and political leverage they enjoyed came at a significant price. Every move they made was scrutinized, every alliance tested, and every decision fraught with potential consequences. In the world of ancient politics, power was fleeting, and the moment a ruler was no longer seen as useful or powerful enough, she could be swiftly disposed of. The danger was not just in the threat of assassination or betrayal from external forces. It was the constant undercurrent of instability within the royal court, where power struggles often played out behind closed doors, with lives hanging in the balance. Cleopatra's reign is a powerful example of the dangerous game she played to maintain her position. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just romantic liaisons, they were strategic moves, designed to keep Egypt independent from the growing power of Rome. Cleopatra, with her political savvy and shrewdness, understood that the only way to survive in a world dominated by men was to play the game better than anyone else. But even her unmatched brilliance couldn't shield her from the harsh realities of power. Her relationship with Antony, which made her an ally of Rome's most powerful man, also made her an enemy to many in Rome. Cleopatra was seen as a threat by Augustus, then Octavian, who would later become the first emperor of Rome. In the end, Cleopatra's ability to survive politically was not enough to protect her from the fatal consequences of being too powerful in a world where women were not easily allowed to remain in control. After Antony's defeat and death, Cleopatra found herself trapped in a corner, her political survival hanging by a thread. Faced with the prospect of being paraded through Rome as a defeated enemy, she chose to take her life. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's fate serves as a chilling reminder that, for all her political maneuvering, her power was always at the mercy of the whims of those who held more sway in the world. The violent end of Cleopatra was far from an isolated case. In fact, many queens met their demise due to the very power they wielded. Hatshepsut, Egypt's long-reigning female pharaoh, also faced the harsh consequences of being too powerful for the men around her. When Hatshepsut ascended to the throne, she took unprecedented steps dressing as a male pharaoh and assuming full authority. Her reign brought prosperity and peace, but her gender was a constant source of contention. After her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, sought to erase her from history. Monuments bearing her name were defaced, her statues destroyed, and her very legacy was attacked. While the reasons for this erasure are debated, it's clear that Thutmose III viewed his stepmother as a threat. He may have felt that her reign, though successful, was an affront to the traditional order of male authority. Despite her accomplishments, Hatshepsut's power was never fully recognized by those around her, and her legacy was erased not just by the hands of her rivals, but by the very society she sought to lead. Nefertiti, too, faced her own battles with power. As the queen and co-regent alongside her husband, Akhenaten, she played a central role in the religious revolution that radically shifted Egypt's worship from the traditional gods to the sole worship of the sun disk. Aten. But the political repercussions of these religious reforms were immense. After Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti's role became clouded in mystery. Some scholars speculate that she may have briefly ruled as pharaoh herself under a different name, but her reign, if it existed, was short-lived. There is evidence to suggest that Nefertiti's influence waned in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, and her image was erased from many official records. Like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut, Nefertiti's power was compromised by the very forces that enabled her rise: religious upheaval, political intrigue, and the male-dominated structures that defined Egyptian society. Her name disappeared from Egypt's official history, possibly because of her association with Akhenaten's controversial reforms, which were reversed by his successors. Nefertiti's fading influence serves as a reminder that even the most powerful queens could find their authority slipping away, erased not by their enemies, but by the very systems they sought to change. The hidden dangers faced by these women were not only external but also internal. They had to deal with the constant tension between maintaining their political strength while fulfilling the traditional roles expected of them as women. They were expected to be both powerful rulers and nurturing mothers, wise advisors and obedient wives. The public image they had to maintain was often a fragile facade, easily shattered by any perceived weakness. This pressure to uphold a perfect image was not just about vanity, it was a matter of survival. The moment a queen was seen as vulnerable or incapable, she could be replaced, discarded, or worse. In Egypt's royal courts, power was not simply about military might or divine right. It was about maintaining an image, ensuring that others saw the ruler as strong, capable, and, above all, indispensable. For queens, this image was often the difference between life and death. The more powerful they became, the more they stood out as targets. Any misstep, any hint of weakness, could lead to betrayal, rebellion, or assassination. Queens were not only political leaders, they were symbols of Egypt's unity and strength, and in the harsh world of power struggles, a queen's fall from grace could bring the entire kingdom to its knees. For many royal women, the cost of their power was not simply the battles they fought or the alliances they formed. It was the constant threat that they could be replaced, removed, or erased from history. In their quest to hold onto their thrones, they often faced a brutal reality. Their very strength made them vulnerable. The power that had once elevated them now stood as a target on their backs, one that could be struck by those who sought to claim what they had built. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the more subtle and insidious dangers that these royal women faced. It was not just the physical threats from political rivals that they had to contend with, but also the quieter, more persistent pressures that came with being a woman in a world that never truly accepted their authority. These hidden dangers were often more difficult to see, but their effects were no less profound. The next chapter will delve into the personal toll these challenges took on the lives of Egypt's most powerful women, and how they navigated the precarious path of power in a world that was determined to keep them in check. While the pharaohs and queens fought for their thrones, the everyday women of ancient Egypt fought for their lives, their dignity, and their place in a world designed to keep them invisible. For many, the dangers they faced were not as dramatic or overt as the political intrigues that surrounded the royal courts, but they were no less perilous. These quiet threats shaped their lives in ways that were often hidden from the public eye, threats that were rooted in societal pressures, health risks, and the profound limitations placed upon them by the power structures of their time. In a society where gender roles were strictly defined, women in ancient Egypt had little room to deviate from the expected norms. From the moment of birth, they were shaped by expectations that confined them to certain roles: daughter, wife, mother, and dictated their every move. Their autonomy was restricted by these roles, as well as by the societal structures that reinforced male authority. Women had fewer legal rights than men, and were often treated as property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. Even within the royal family, where women held positions of significant influence, the shadow of gender inequality loomed large, limiting their ability to fully control their own destinies. This constant threat was a shadow over the lives of every woman in Egypt, from the royal palace to the poorest village. Queens and commoners alike could succumb to complications that would render their families and their communities vulnerable. Even with the best medical care available, the unpredictability of childbirth was a fact of life for every woman in ancient Egypt, and many did not survive to see their children grow. In a society that placed such high value on motherhood and fertility, the loss of a woman during childbirth was not only a personal tragedy, but a threat to the stability of the family and, by extension, the community. Health risks extended beyond childbirth, however. Illness was another invisible danger that women in ancient Egypt had to navigate. While the Egyptians had some advanced medical practices, there were still many diseases that they could neither understand nor treat. Infectious diseases, malnutrition, and the lack of hygiene were widespread in ancient Egypt, and women were particularly vulnerable. Their daily lives involved tasks that exposed them to unsanitary conditions, whether they were preparing food, fetching water, or tending to their homes. These risks compounded with the pressures they faced in the domestic sphere, where they were expected to maintain the health of their families while often bearing the brunt of physical labor. The social pressures women faced were not limited to health concerns. The weight of societal expectations also shaped their daily lives in ways that were less immediately obvious, but equally harmful. Women were expected to be the keepers of the home, managing everything from food production to child rearing. Their worth was often measured by their ability to produce heirs and care for their husbands, and failure to do so was seen as a significant personal and social failure. For many women, their entire identity was wrapped up in their roles as wives and mothers. The pressure to live up to these ideals could be overwhelming, and any deviation from these expectations often led to harsh judgment or even ostracization. While this was true for women in all walks of life, the pressures were particularly intense for those in the royal family. The queens of Egypt, despite their positions of power, were not immune to the subtle but powerful societal expectations that shaped the lives of all women. They were expected to embody both strength and fertility, to be powerful rulers while also fulfilling their traditional roles as wives and mothers. The stress of living up to such expectations could be mentally and emotionally exhausting. A queen's worth was not only tied to her political accomplishments, but also to her ability to fulfill her familial duties. In a patriarchal society, where women's roles were seen as secondary, the queens had to continuously prove that their power was earned, not inherited. The internal struggles these women faced were not always acknowledged, but they were deeply felt. Queens like Cleopatra, despite their public political personas, were constantly navigating the pressures of being both a ruler and a woman. The pressure to maintain their image, both in the court and in public perception, was a constant source of anxiety. They had to balance their roles as powerful leaders with the societal expectations of femininity and motherhood. This delicate balancing act often took a significant emotional toll on them, as they were constantly under scrutiny, not just for their political decisions, but for their personal lives as well. It is not only the queens who faced these invisible dangers, but women of all classes. In a world where women were often seen as property, their autonomy was severely restricted. They were expected to submit to their husbands, fathers, or other male figures in their lives. A woman's body was not her own, but something that belonged to the male figures who controlled her. Whether it was in the home, the temple, or the royal court, women's lives were shaped by these power structures that constantly reinforced their subjugation. Even in the relative freedom of the temples, where women held significant religious authority, their power was often tempered by the overall patriarchal structure that dominated the political and social realms. This lack of control over their own bodies and lives was perhaps one of the most insidious dangers faced by women in ancient Egypt. Women had little legal recourse if they were abused, neglected, or mistreated. Divorce, though possible, was often not in a woman's favor, and she could be left without financial support or social standing if her marriage ended. In many cases, women's personal freedom was sacrificed for the good of the family or the state, particularly in the royal courts, where marriage and alliances were political tools. Their personal desires and emotions were often secondary to their role in ensuring the kingdom's stability or securing the next generation of rulers. As we move forward into Chapter 5, we will explore the emotional and psychological toll these pressures took on women. The subtle dangers that plagued their daily lives, health risks, societal pressures, and the control over their bodies are part of a larger narrative of survival. In the next chapter, we will dive deeper into the emotional complexities of their lives, examining how intimacy, love, and personal identity were shaped in a world that sought to keep them in the shadows. The psychological toll of living within these constraints is a vital piece of the puzzle in understanding the full depth of women's lives in ancient Egypt. In a world where power was everything, where the great pharaohs and queens commanded armies and empires, where the very stability of a kingdom rested on divine favor, the women of ancient Egypt faced an emotional paradox. On the one hand, they were expected to embody the ideals of strength, duty, and political power. On the other hand, their personal lives, their emotions, and their relationships, those intangible elements of human existence, were inextricably linked to their roles as wives, mothers, and daughters. But how did these women navigate the intricate web of love, duty, and power? Were their hearts free to love as they wished, or were they bound by the chains of expectation, tradition, and the demands of their kingdoms? Marriage, for many women in ancient Egypt, was not solely about love, it was a political and social contract. For queens especially, marriage was a means of securing alliances, ensuring the stability of the royal family, and preserving Egypt's position in the world. But despite the transactional nature of these unions, love and companionship were not entirely absent. In the royal court, where alliances were forged through marriage, queens like Cleopatra and Nefertiti still experienced the emotional complexities of their relationships, even though their marriages were often driven by politics and power dynamics. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, for example, were not just about affection, they were deeply political alliances that allowed her to maintain Egypt's independence. Yet, in the midst of this political intrigue, there was genuine companionship, a shared bond between two people who had to navigate the complexities of love and duty in an extraordinarily challenging world. For queens like Cleopatra, love was both a tool and a genuine source of emotional connection. Her heart may have been entwined with the fates of the men she aligned herself with, but there was more to her relationships than simply securing power. Cleopatra was a woman who, in many ways, broke the mold. Her personal emotions were never fully separate from her political ambitions, but neither were they devoid of authenticity. She managed to intertwine love with the deep political currents that shaped her reign, creating relationships that were as emotionally complex as they were strategically brilliant. Yet, even in the royal sphere, where love could be a force of both personal connection and political strength, the lives of women in ancient Egypt were also marked by the limitations of their roles. They were often seen through the lens of their husbands, fathers, and sons. The pressure to marry well, produce heirs, and maintain the family's standing was immense, and it shaped the very nature of how women approached love and intimacy. For many women in Egypt, particularly those in the elite or royal classes, their relationships were often more about duty than desire. Their personal lives, though potentially filled with affection, were also shaped by the roles they were expected to play within the family structure. The idea of romantic love, as we understand it today, was not entirely absent from ancient Egypt, but it was often subordinated to the needs of the state, the family, and religion. Marriage was a sacred institution, and the creation of a family was integral to the continuity of Egyptian society. Women's emotional lives were often shaped by their responsibilities to their children and their husbands. They were tasked not only with managing the household, but also with ensuring that their lineage continued. Their identities were intertwined with their familial roles. Who they were as wives and mothers was often more important than who they were as individuals. However, this does not mean that the emotional lives of Egyptian women were devoid of tenderness or affection. Evidence from tombs, love poetry, and inscriptions suggests that many women in ancient Egypt had deep emotional connections with their partners. Letters of love and devotion were often exchanged between husbands and wives, especially in the middle and lower classes. These documents, though not as celebrated as the grand historical accounts of pharaohs and wars, offer a glimpse into the quiet love that existed in private lives. Some letters, found in tombs or scribbled on papyrus, speak of affection, longing, and the desire to be together, showing that even in a society as structured as Egypt, human emotions could not be easily controlled or confined. The relationship between love and power, however, was not always straightforward. Queens and royal women faced a unique challenge: the need to maintain their dignity and authority while simultaneously fulfilling the emotional roles that society demanded of them. A queen could not afford to show vulnerability, especially in the political realm, where every action was scrutinized for signs of weakness. Yet, the pressures of marriage, motherhood, and political responsibility often forced them to confront these vulnerabilities. For example, while Cleopatra's public image was that of a powerful, independent ruler, it is clear that her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not simply political, they were deeply personal. Cleopatra's ability to maintain her authority while engaging in these intimate relationships speaks to the complexity of balancing power and emotion in a male-dominated world. Similarly, Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful female pharaohs, navigated the delicate balance between love, duty, and power in her marriage to Thutmose II. While much of her reign was marked by political and economic stability, Hatshepsut's decision to assume the title of pharaoh and adopt the male regalia created tensions in her personal life. Her relationship with her stepson, Thutmose III, who was originally the rightful heir to the throne, was complex, as Hatshepsut's decision to rule as pharaoh meant she had to assert her authority in a way that may have strained their bond. Her reign, though prosperous, was not without emotional and psychological cost. The love between her and her royal family, as well as her identity as both a mother and ruler, was challenged by her public role as pharaoh. For the everyday women of Egypt, these tensions were perhaps even more pronounced. They too were bound by societal expectations of love and marriage, but their circumstances were far less luxurious than those of the queens. The lives of ordinary women were shaped by their roles as wives and mothers, and their emotional lives often revolved around the care and management of the family. While there may have been moments of personal affection and happiness, the constant pressure to maintain the home, raise children, and uphold societal expectations left little room for personal freedom. In this sense, their relationships were shaped by the harsh realities of their social roles, and love, though deeply felt, was often overshadowed by duty. In the private world of Egypt's royal women, love and emotional connection were powerful forces, but they were also constrained by the political realities that came with their status. The tension between power and intimacy, duty and desire, was ever present. Queens were expected to maintain the public image of strength, leadership, and divine authority, but beneath the surface, they were women who, like all people, felt the pull of love, companionship, and personal connection. Yet, the weight of their roles often meant that their emotional lives were subordinated to the needs of the kingdom, their love intertwined with their duty to Egypt. As we move forward into Chapter 6, we will take a deeper look at the psychological toll these emotional dynamics took on women in ancient Egypt. The complexities of their emotional and personal lives, often repressed by the demands of duty and power, left a profound mark on their identities. In the next chapter, we will explore how these women navigated their emotional worlds and how the intersection of love, identity, and duty shaped their psychological well-being in a society that demanded perfection from them, both publicly and privately. Behind the crown, beyond the veil, was a woman caught in the conflict of identity. Who was she beneath the roles she was forced to play? And how did the weight of Egypt's expectations affect her soul? In a society where power was synonymous with duty, the lives of royal and priestly women in ancient Egypt were defined by the constant tension between personal identity and the roles imposed upon them. They were expected to be perfect wives, mothers, priestesses, and rulers, each identity coming with its own set of demands, its own set of sacrifices. Beneath the grandiose images of queens and divine mothers lay the unseen, often painful struggle for selfhood, as women navigated a world where their personal desires were frequently sidelined in favor of their public duties. The pressures faced by royal women were uniquely complex. Unlike their male counterparts, who could more easily separate their personal desires from their public roles, women were expected to embody a fusion of both. As wives, they had to be loyal, supportive, and obedient to their husbands, especially in the case of queens who were married to pharaohs or influential leaders. As mothers, they had to ensure the continuation of the dynasty, bearing heirs to secure the future of the kingdom. And as rulers, they were expected to lead with the authority of a king, while upholding the ideals of femininity, grace, and fertility. For women in the royal courts and temples, the expectations were suffocating. Their very identities were often defined by their relationship to the men around them, whether as the wife of a pharaoh, the mother of the heir, or the daughter of a god. The weight of this public identity was immense, leaving little room for personal expression. For queens like Cleopatra, the conflict between personal identity and public duty was a constant battle. While she was revered as the ruler of Egypt, her identity was bound up in her relationships with the Roman leaders who helped secure her throne. Cleopatra's alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were as much about survival as they were about love or political ambition. These relationships were not simply private matters. They were the foundation of her power. Yet, how much of her personal self could truly be expressed in such politically charged circumstances? Cleopatra's image as the seductive, exotic queen often overshadowed her intellect and leadership skills, reducing her to a mere figure of desire rather than a woman with real political power. The public's perception of her was heavily shaped by her roles as a lover and political ally, not by her true capabilities as a ruler. Behind the public facade, Cleopatra must have struggled with the tension between the woman she truly was and the queen the world expected her to be. The weight of Egypt's expectations, coupled with the very real threat of betrayal from her political allies, must have taken a psychological toll. Hatshepsut's reign, while less dramatic in its political alliances, was marked by a similarly complex struggle for identity. As the first woman to formally take the title of pharaoh, Hatshepsut defied societal norms in a way that few had before her. Yet, in doing so, she found herself torn between two identities: the powerful male pharaoh who would command armies and make monumental decisions, and the woman who had to maintain a certain softness, a connection to the divine femininity that the Egyptian gods had traditionally embodied. Hatshepsut's decision to adopt male regalia and even a beard was an act of defiance, yet it was also a manifestation of the internal conflict she likely experienced. By presenting herself as a male pharaoh, she denied the very gender identity that society imposed upon her. This internal discord likely shaped her sense of self and her emotional well-being. How could she reconcile the image of herself as both a woman and a king? The pressure for queens and powerful women in ancient Egypt to conform to these prescribed roles was not only external but internal. It wasn't just about how they were perceived by the public or their male counterparts. It was about the personal conflict they faced when their desires and needs conflicted with the duties imposed upon them. Every decision, whether political, familial, or personal, came with the heavy burden of maintaining an image. They were expected to be pillars of strength, wisdom, and grace, with little room for vulnerability or self-doubt. What, then, was left of their true selves when their entire identity was shaped by the roles they played? For women like Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti, the internal struggle for personal identity was compounded by the need to constantly prove their worth as rulers in a world that doubted the legitimacy of female leadership. Moreover, these royal women were not alone in this struggle. Women in the priestly sphere, though often granted a certain level of autonomy and respect due to their spiritual roles, were also subjected to intense pressure. Priestesses were expected to be paragons of virtue, piety, and service to the gods. Their personal lives were often overshadowed by the sacred duties they performed within the temples. A priestess's identity was almost entirely defined by her spiritual role, leaving little space for personal expression or romantic love. In the case of powerful priestesses who held significant sway within the temples, their emotional lives were likely as constrained as those of their royal counterparts. The psychological toll of leading a life devoted entirely to religious service, without the opportunity to express individual desires, must have been immense. Yet, even for women who lived outside the temples or royal courts, the societal expectations were deeply constricting. In a society where marriage and motherhood were seen as the pinnacle of a woman's life, the emotional and psychological toll of failing to meet these expectations would have been profound. Women who could not bear children or failed to marry in a socially acceptable way may have faced not just public shame but personal despair. While love was certainly a valued emotion in ancient Egyptian society, evident in love, poetry, and affectionate letters between husbands and wives, the cultural pressure to meet traditional roles could make any deviation from those norms psychologically damaging. Women's worth was often seen as inseparable from their ability to bear children and fulfill the familial roles expected of them. The emotional toll of living in such a rigid, expectation-driven society would have affected not just royal women, but all women in Egypt, regardless of their social status. The emotional and psychological conflicts that royal and priestly women faced were compounded by their inability to fully control their lives. They were subject to the decisions of male rulers, the demands of their families, and the will of the gods. For queens like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut, their positions were often precarious. The expectations placed upon them by society, combined with the personal sacrifices they made for the sake of the throne or their family, created a constant state of inner conflict. How could they maintain their humanity while fulfilling the immense duties expected of them? How could they balance the fierce ambition required to lead with the quiet longing for personal freedom and self-expression? As we move into the next chapter, we will delve deeper into how these women navigated these psychological struggles. Despite the immense challenges they faced, they managed to survive and, in some cases, thrive. The tools they used to negotiate these conflicts, whether through strategic alliances, manipulation of public image, or sheer resilience, are essential to understanding how they carved out spaces for themselves in a world that constantly sought to confine them. Their ability to survive and even flourish, despite these pressures, speaks to the strength of their identities, both as women and as rulers. In Chapter 7, we will explore these strategies in more detail, examining how these women used their intelligence, resilience, and resourcefulness to navigate a world that was often determined to erase their influence. Given the immense pressure placed upon them, how did women in ancient Egypt manage to assert themselves, often without raising a voice? How did they navigate the restrictive societal norms that sought to confine them to rigid roles? And what strategies did they employ to protect their own lives and even their legacies? In a world where their power was constantly undermined, these women found subtle yet profound ways to claim agency over their lives, weaving resilience into the very fabric of their existence. Though their struggles were often silent, their victories, however small, are no less remarkable. The coping mechanisms employed by women in ancient Egypt were varied and complex, shaped by both necessity and ingenuity. While royal women, priestesses, and commoners each faced their own set of challenges, they all shared a common need to assert some control over their circumstances. This need, however, was often met through means that would be invisible to the casual observer, taking the form of rituals, relationships, and forms of resistance that were deeply embedded in the social and religious structures of Egyptian society. One of the most important strategies for women to assert control over their lives was through ritual. Ancient Egypt placed great emphasis on the power of ritual in maintaining balance and harmony with the divine. Women, particularly in the religious sphere, used these rituals to carve out spaces of influence and personal empowerment. Priestesses, who were entrusted with performing sacred rites in the temples, often held significant authority in their communities. Their rituals were not only a means of honoring the gods, but also a way to affirm their own power within the temple and the society at large. These women were often the mediators between the divine and the mortal worlds, and their authority in this realm gave them a unique form of control. Through rituals of self-empowerment, women in ancient Egypt could assert their spiritual and personal autonomy. For example, the practice of invoking the goddess Ma'at, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order, was one that could be used by women to empower themselves within their roles as caretakers of balance and order in their homes, families, and temples. The act of invoking Ma'at was not merely a religious gesture. It was a statement of one's ability to maintain order in a world that was often chaotic and oppressive. By aligning themselves with Ma'at, women could feel connected to a greater divine purpose, empowering themselves in the face of overwhelming societal constraints. In addition to rituals, women in ancient Egypt found strength through their relationships with other women. While patriarchal structures dominated public life, private spaces often allowed women to cultivate deep bonds with each other. These relationships, though rarely recorded in history, were no less vital. Women supported each other emotionally, socially, and even politically. In royal circles, queens and princesses sometimes worked together to ensure the stability of the dynasty. For example, the relationship between Cleopatra and her female court members, many of whom were part of her political circle, was critical in maintaining her rule. These women provided counsel, emotional support, and strategic alliances that allowed Cleopatra to navigate the treacherous political waters of Rome and Egypt. Beyond the royal sphere, women in daily life also found solidarity with one another. In a society where women's lives were primarily defined by their roles as mothers and wives, the bonds between women in similar circumstances were a source of strength. These relationships could provide an avenue for women to express their true emotions, share their experiences, and offer mutual support in the face of societal expectations that left little room for individuality. Whether in the form of shared childcare responsibilities, collective mourning rituals, or simply offering a listening ear, these networks of female support were essential in helping women cope with the emotional and psychological toll of their lives. Even for the women who lived outside the realm of royalty and religion, forms of resistance existed. While they were not likely to engage in overt political battles or religious rites, many everyday women found ways to carve out spaces of personal agency in their homes and communities. One of the most significant areas where women exercised their influence was in the management of the household. Egyptian women, particularly those of the middle and lower classes, had substantial responsibilities within their homes, including managing food, finances, and the upbringing of children. In this domain, women were not just passive caregivers. They were the backbone of Egyptian family life, and their ability to manage these responsibilities allowed them to assert control over their environments. Moreover, women in ancient Egypt were not entirely dependent on men for their legal or financial status. Women had the ability to own property, engage in trade, and enter into contracts. This autonomy, though limited compared to men, gave women some degree of agency in the social and economic spheres. In a world where wealth and status were paramount, this financial independence allowed women to exert a measure of control over their lives. Women who were widowed, for example, were often able to manage their own estates, a form of independence that allowed them to maintain both their social standing and personal dignity. But even with these forms of autonomy, women's lives were still shaped by the constraints of the power structures around them. Much of the resistance that women in ancient Egypt engaged in was subtle, small victories that may not have been recorded in the annals of history, but were no less significant. A woman's ability to assert herself in a world that sought to keep her in the background was a powerful act of defiance. Whether through small acts of rebellion, strategic alliances, or emotional endurance, women found ways to protect their identities and their legacies in a society that continually sought to suppress them. As we explore further, the question arises: what legacy did these women leave behind, and how were their stories erased or hidden from history? Despite their agency, many of these women's contributions have gone unrecognized or were minimized by later historians and conquerors. Yet, their stories often passed down through whispered legends, fragmented texts, or the rituals they performed continue to resonate. In many ways, the most enduring aspect of these women's legacies lies in the quiet, unseen strength they exhibited. This section sets the stage for Chapter 8, where we will delve into how the power, influence, and agency of these women, despite being overlooked by historical records, still shaped the course of Egyptian history. Their actions, whether bold or subtle, left an indelible mark on the kingdom. And as we continue our exploration, we will uncover the true depth of their stories. It is in these hidden spaces where power was wielded not with a sword, but through resilience, intelligence, and careful negotiation that the real strength of Egypt's women can be found. What if everything we thought we knew about Egypt's power structures was only half the story? Could there have been hidden figures whose influence has been erased from history? For centuries, the history of ancient Egypt has been written largely by men, pharaohs, military leaders, and male priests whose names dominate the historical narrative. But what happens when we start to look beyond the well-documented male rulers and acknowledge the roles of the women who helped shape this ancient civilization? The contributions of these women have often been relegated to the margins or erased entirely, their power dismissed or overshadowed by the grand figures of Egyptian kingship. Yet, as scholars and historians increasingly turn their attention to these overlooked women, we begin to uncover a far more complex and nuanced story, one where women, far from being passive figures, held significant sway in both the political and spiritual realms of Egypt. The history of ancient Egypt, like much of recorded history, has been dominated by the voices of men. The grand monuments and elaborate tombs we associate with Egypt's past were often constructed by male pharaohs and military leaders whose deeds were carefully documented by court scribes. These kings, men like Ramses II, Thutmose III, and Akhenaten, are often the focus of modern retellings of Egypt's past, while the voices of women, who held their own power and influence, have been relegated to the shadows. The patriarchal structure of ancient Egyptian society has led to a historical narrative that elevates male power and, in doing so, minimizes or completely overlooks the contributions of women, especially in the political and religious spheres. However, this selective telling of history is not a reflection of the true nature of ancient Egypt. Women, particularly those in the royal family and priestly roles, wielded considerable power. Queens like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra were not mere figureheads. They were active participants in the governance of Egypt, shaping the kingdom's politics and diplomacy. Yet, despite their power, these women often found their legacies obscured or even erased by later rulers or historians. In the case of Hatshepsut, for example, her stepson Thutmose III sought to diminish her legacy after her death, erasing her name from many monuments and attempting to rewrite history to favor his own reign. This deliberate erasure was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of her rule, reflecting the deep-seated resistance to women holding such power. The suppression of women's contributions to Egyptian history is not unique to Hatshepsut. The roles of women in religious life were similarly underrepresented in the historical record. Priestesses, for example, were often responsible for performing sacred rituals, managing temple wealth, and maintaining religious traditions. Yet their contributions were not always celebrated in the same way as their male counterparts. Priestesses, like those in the temple of Isis or Hathor, were essential to the functioning of Egyptian society, yet their influence was largely undocumented. Their spiritual authority allowed them to wield significant power, not just within the temple but within their communities. Yet this influence was often downplayed or hidden by historians who focused primarily on the male religious elite. The impact of these women, however, was far from insignificant. In the case of Cleopatra, her political and diplomatic efforts have been overshadowed by the romanticized myths surrounding her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. While these relationships were certainly important, they were also politically motivated, and Cleopatra's real power lay in her ability to navigate the complexities of Roman politics to protect Egypt's independence. Yet, despite her skill and political acumen, the history that has been handed down to us often reduces her to a seductive queen whose power was secondary to her allure. The real story of Cleopatra, her intelligence, her leadership, and her resilience is often lost in the legends and myths that have come to define her. Historians have begun to re-evaluate these narratives, shedding light on the roles that women played in the creation and preservation of Egypt's grandeur. Archaeological discoveries, such as inscriptions and texts that were once ignored or misinterpreted, have helped reveal the true extent of women's involvement in Egypt's political and religious life. For example, the discovery of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari has provided valuable insight into her reign, showing that her rule was not only legitimate, but also successful in terms of economic prosperity and monumental construction. Similarly, the rediscovery of Cleopatra's coins and writings has helped to paint a more accurate picture of her reign, highlighting her role as a diplomat and leader, rather than reducing her to a mere object of desire. The efforts to uncover and highlight these hidden stories have been supported by a new generation of scholars who are committed to bringing the voices of these women to the forefront. The increasing availability of digital tools and advanced archaeological methods has made it easier to uncover these forgotten histories, and these discoveries are challenging the long-held assumptions about the role of women in ancient Egypt. By looking beyond the traditional sources of male-dominated narratives, historians are piecing together a more complete picture of Egypt's past, one that acknowledges the significant contributions of women in the shaping of the civilization. This rediscovery of women's power is not just about correcting historical oversights. It's also about understanding the complexities of power and gender in ancient Egypt. Women in Egypt, particularly in the royal and priestly spheres, were often expected to balance personal duty with public expectation. Their roles were fraught with contradictions. On one hand, they were seen as divine figures, embodiments of fertility and motherhood, while on the other hand, they were expected to govern, lead, and make critical decisions that impacted the fate of the kingdom. These women's ability to navigate this complex web of expectations, to assert their authority while conforming to the roles imposed upon them, speaks to their remarkable resilience and strength. Yet, for all the power they wielded, these women often left behind a historical record that was shaped by the men who came after them. The men who wrote the history of Egypt were not likely to see the same significance in the actions of women as they did in the deeds of male rulers. As a result, the contributions of queens, priestesses, and other women in positions of power were often minimized, obscured, or completely erased from the historical record. The result is a history of Egypt that is incomplete, one that leaves out half of the story of the women who helped shape the kingdom's destiny. As we explore the hidden power of women in ancient Egypt, we begin to see that these women were not merely passive figures. They were active participants in the shaping of Egypt's political, religious, and cultural landscape. Yet their stories, like many other women's stories throughout history, have been overshadowed by the louder voices of their male counterparts. Their legacies were obscured, their contributions overlooked, and their power minimized. However, through modern scholarship, we are beginning to rediscover these women and give them the recognition they deserve. The stories of queens like Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti, along with those of countless other women whose names have been lost to time, are starting to emerge from the shadows. This section sets the stage for the next, where we will look more closely at specific women whose legacies were overshadowed or forgotten by mainstream history. Their stories will serve not only as revelations about the hidden contributions of women to Egypt's power structures, but also as a call for a deeper investigation into the complex and often overlooked roles that women played in shaping one of the world's most powerful civilizations. From behind the veil of time, the true faces of Egypt's powerful women are emerging. Who were these forgotten queens, and what power did they truly hold? Throughout much of history, the roles of women in ancient Egypt have been shrouded in obscurity, their contributions either overlooked or deliberately erased by the male-centric narratives that have long dominated the story of this ancient civilization. Yet, as modern archaeology and historical scholarship evolve, the forgotten legacies of these women are being brought back to life. Figures like Ta, the wife of Amenhotep III, and Meritaten, whose political and religious roles were critical but largely unrecognized, are slowly reclaiming their rightful place in Egypt's history. Their stories, once buried beneath the overwhelming presence of their male counterparts, are now beginning to shine through, revealing the true extent of their power, influence, and resilience. Take Ta, for example, one of the most influential women in ancient Egypt, whose name, despite her pivotal role, has often been overshadowed by her husband's and son's prominence. Ta was the great royal wife of Amenhotep III, the 18th dynasty pharaoh, and the mother of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who radically changed Egypt's religious landscape. Ta's influence was not merely confined to the royal harem or the domestic sphere. She played a central role in the political and diplomatic affairs of Egypt. She was deeply involved in the governance of Egypt during Amenhotep III's long reign, which is remembered for its diplomatic successes and vast wealth. Ta held significant sway over foreign policy, participating in key diplomatic negotiations with neighboring powers, including the Mitanni and Babylon, and her correspondence with foreign kings highlights her diplomatic acumen. Ta's power was not just political but also religious. She was revered as a divine figure, often associated with the goddess Hathor, and she had an enormous influence on religious matters during her husband's reign. Ta's name was included in inscriptions alongside Amenhotep III's, emphasizing her high status. Furthermore, her presence at court during the reign of Akhenaten, despite the latter's radical religious reforms, shows her continuing influence. In fact, Ta's influence may have even extended to the early years of Akhenaten's reign before the full force of his religious revolution took hold. However, despite her immense power, Ta's legacy has often been overshadowed by the actions of her son, Akhenaten, and his controversial religious changes. She was, in many ways, the behind-the-scenes architect of Egyptian diplomacy, but her role in history was largely erased as male rulers came to dominate the narrative. Meritaten, Ta's granddaughter and the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, is another powerful figure whose legacy has been sidelined. Meritaten's role in the court during the Amarna period, when Akhenaten radically shifted Egypt's religious practices in favor of the sun god Aten, was crucial to the political and religious landscape of the time. As the queen during the early years of Akhenaten's reign, Meritaten was deeply involved in the administration of the kingdom. She was a central figure in the religious reforms, and her status as the daughter of Nefertiti, one of Egypt's most well-known queens, placed her at the heart of the royal family's struggles with the power dynamics of the period. Though little is known about Meritaten's direct involvement in governance, her symbolic importance is undeniable. As a co-regent or potential ruler, in the wake of her father Akhenaten's death, she appears to have wielded considerable influence during a time of immense political and religious upheaval. After Akhenaten's death, Meritaten was likely involved in the brief and tumultuous reign of her husband, Smenkhkare, and may have briefly ruled as pharaoh herself. Her name appears on many inscriptions during this period, but the official records were unclear about her exact role, likely due to her gender and the shifting political powers at the time. Once her brother, Tutankhamun, assumed the throne, Meritaten's political importance began to fade from the historical record. Meritaten's legacy, much like Tiye's, was overshadowed by the patriarchal nature of the Egyptian historical narrative, which focused heavily on the male pharaohs, particularly her father Akhenaten and her husband, Smenkhare. Despite her potential as a ruler and her importance in the religious reforms of the time, her name and achievements were deliberately obscured, and she has often been relegated to the shadows of history. The lack of recognition of her role highlights the broader issue of women's contributions being minimized or erased from the historical record, particularly in the context of royal politics and the complex dynamics of Egyptian religion. These examples are just the beginning of a larger, more widespread trend throughout Egyptian history. Women in positions of power, whether as queens, priestesses, or regents, were often marginalized by the annals of history, with their legacies either erased or diminished. Many of the achievements of women in ancient Egypt, particularly those related to governance, diplomacy, and religion, were overshadowed by the dominant figures of male rulers. Whether it was through the destruction of inscriptions, the alteration of texts, or the simple omission of their names from official records, the voices of powerful women in Egypt have too often been silenced. This historical erasure of women's contributions is not unique to Egypt. Throughout history, the stories of powerful women have been consistently marginalized, with their roles often diminished in favor of men's accomplishments. Yet, as modern scholarship continues to evolve, there is a growing recognition of the need to recover these lost voices. Archaeological discoveries, the translation of ancient texts, and new interpretive methods have allowed us to begin to piece together the stories of women who were once forgotten or overlooked. In many cases, the contributions of these women were not necessarily hidden, but subtly suppressed by a historical narrative that placed more value on male rulers and male-dominated institutions. Efforts to rediscover and highlight the roles of women in ancient Egypt are gaining momentum. Scholars are increasingly turning their attention to the overlooked figures of history, those women whose power was as significant as the men who ruled beside them, but whose stories have been buried beneath centuries of patriarchal control. As a result, we are beginning to see a more accurate, more complete picture of ancient Egypt, one that acknowledges the importance of its queens, priestesses, and influential women, and gives them the recognition they deserve. This section sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the modern methods and technologies that have enabled us to uncover these hidden stories. Through archaeological discoveries, digital tools, and a re-examination of ancient texts, our understanding of ancient Egypt continues to evolve, shedding light on the forgotten women whose legacies were once obscured by time and tradition. These rediscovered figures serve not only as revelations of Egypt's rich history, but as a testament to the enduring influence of women who, despite being overshadowed, have left an indelible mark on the civilization. Each new discovery brings us closer to understanding the untold stories of Egypt's women. What new truths will emerge, and how will they redefine our vision of this ancient civilization? In recent years, the revelations unearthed through archaeological digs, digital analysis, and reinterpretations of ancient texts have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of ancient Egypt, particularly when it comes to the roles and power of women. For centuries, the historical narrative of ancient Egypt was dominated by the stories of male rulers and military heroes. But now, through careful examination of evidence long buried or dismissed, the contributions of women in Egypt's political, religious, and social spheres are coming into clearer focus. These discoveries are not only rewriting the history of ancient Egypt, they are also altering the broader understanding of gender in the ancient world, showing that women were far more than passive figures in a male-dominated society. The revelations about Egypt's powerful women are not merely academic, they are transforming the way we understand the structures of power in the ancient world. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often envision the towering pyramids, the monumental tombs of pharaohs, and the great military conquests. But behind these grand narratives lies a more complex picture, one in which women played a central role, shaping the political landscape, guiding religious practices and influencing the cultural and social life of the kingdom. As scholars and archaeologists uncover these hidden stories, we are beginning to see that women in ancient Egypt wielded significant power, often in ways that were overlooked or suppressed by traditional historical accounts. Take, for example, the rediscovery of Tiye's influence as the wife of Amenhotep III. For decades, her role was underestimated, with much of the focus being placed on her husband's reign and the diplomatic successes of the 18th dynasty. However, recent studies of inscriptions and royal correspondence have revealed that Tiye was not merely a supportive queen. She was an active participant in Egypt's political and diplomatic relations. Tiye's involvement in foreign diplomacy, particularly her communication with neighboring rulers, suggests that she played a vital role in preserving Egypt's political stability and ensuring its prosperity. This new understanding challenges the historical narrative that depicted queens as mere ceremonial figures and highlights how Tiye was, in fact, one of the key players in Egypt's geopolitical strategy. As scholars continue to uncover such evidence, we are forced to reconsider the historical importance of royal women and their contributions to the survival and success of the civilization. Similarly, the role of priestesses in Egypt's religious life is now being understood in a more nuanced light. For centuries, the contributions of women in religious ceremonies and temple rituals were downplayed or ignored. Women were often seen as secondary to the male priesthood, and their roles were largely relegated to nurturing or supporting the divine order. Yet, as new archaeological evidence comes to light, we are learning that priestesses in ancient Egypt were far more than just assistants to the male clergy. They were powerful figures in their own right, responsible for managing temple affairs, overseeing the wealth of the gods, and sometimes even taking on leadership roles within religious institutions. The uncovering of inscriptions and the study of religious texts have revealed that priestesses played a vital part in the spiritual and political life of Egypt. Women like those in the Temple of Isis were not simply passive worshippers. They held significant authority, wielded spiritual power, and participated in the governance of the state through their religious duties. This re-evaluation of women's roles in religious and political life also has implications for our understanding of the spiritual landscape of ancient Egypt. The very nature of Egyptian religion, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, was inherently gendered, and women's roles within this structure were far more complex and influential than previously believed. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Ma'at were not just symbolic figures, they were representations of divine power that women could invoke and embody. Priestesses who served these deities were not merely participants in rituals, they were seen as direct conduits to the divine. By recognizing the true spiritual authority of these women, we are not only revising our understanding of their roles, but also gaining a deeper insight into the role gender played in shaping Egypt's religious practices. Moreover, the recent surge in interest in Egypt's female rulers, queens like Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut, has led to a re-evaluation of their political significance. For years, these women were viewed through the lens of their relationships with male figures. Cleopatra with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Nefertiti as the consort of Akhenaten, and Hatshepsut as the wife of Thutmose II. But now, scholars are recognizing that these queens were not merely wives or lovers. They were powerful political figures in their own right. Cleopatra's strategic alliances, Hatshepsut's bold claim to the throne, and Nefertiti's role in Akhenaten's religious reforms all point to the fact that women in ancient Egypt could hold and did hold power that extended far beyond the confines of their marriages. The narrative is shifting from one that diminishes their roles to one that recognizes their agency, intellect, and political acumen. This changing perception is not limited to royalty. The lives of women outside the royal court are also being revisited, with new discoveries shedding light on their roles in society. Documents that were once overlooked, such as letters and legal texts, reveal that women were involved in business, property ownership, and legal disputes. These newly uncovered texts highlight that women in ancient Egypt were not passive subjects to male authority, they were active participants in the economic and legal spheres. Women could own land, conduct trade, and even participate in legal proceedings, a level of autonomy that challenges the traditional view of women in ancient societies as entirely dependent on men. The shift in historical understanding, driven by new archaeological findings and more inclusive historical interpretations, is reshaping how we view gender in ancient Egypt. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that women were not only central to the private, familial aspects of Egyptian life, but also played crucial roles in the political, religious, and cultural domains. Their power and influence, though often hidden or minimized, were vital to the functioning and survival of the civilization. This rethinking of women's roles in ancient Egypt does more than just correct historical inaccuracies. It forces us to reconsider the very structure of Egyptian society. By examining how women navigated the limitations placed upon them, we begin to understand the subtle forms of power that existed within a society that was traditionally seen as patriarchal. Women in ancient Egypt did not simply exist within the boundaries set by their male counterparts. They actively negotiated, manipulated, and leveraged the systems of power to ensure their survival and, at times, to thrive. This section transitions naturally into Chapter 9, where we will explore how the legacies of these women have been preserved in modern times through art, literature, and pop culture, and how their influence continues to shape contemporary perceptions of ancient Egypt. While these women may have been marginalized in ancient records, their stories continue to resonate in the cultural memory of Egypt, and we will see how their impact endures through the lens of modern media and scholarship. The enduring legacy of Egypt's powerful women, long obscured, is beginning to shine through once more, offering new insights into one of the world's most fascinating and complex civilizations. From the pages of history books to the silver screen, the queens and heroines of ancient Egypt have captivated the modern imagination. Figures like Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut have become symbols not just of ancient power, but of timeless allure, intrigue, and strength. But how much of their true legacy survives in these depictions? Over the centuries, the stories of these powerful women have been mythologized, adapted, and often romanticized, turning them into cultural icons. These portrayals have shaped how we view power, femininity, and leadership. Yet they have also sometimes obscured the real influence these women wielded in their own time. The legacy of ancient Egyptian women has endured across millennia, finding its way into the fabric of modern culture. Their images appear in art, literature, and film, often serving as symbols of both beauty and strength. Cleopatra, in particular, has become a symbol of feminine power, her name synonymous with seduction, intrigue, and political maneuvering. From Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal in the 1963 film, Cleopatra's image has evolved into that of a dramatic, alluring queen. Yet this portrayal, while captivating, has little to do with the historical Cleopatra, who, far from being defined by her romantic relationships, was a savvy political strategist, a queen who navigated the complex world of Roman politics with remarkable skill. The modern fascination with Cleopatra is partly due to her ability to blend power with charisma, making her a compelling figure for filmmakers, writers, and artists. Yet, this image of Cleopatra as a seductress often obscures her true political genius. In popular culture, her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony have been exaggerated, overshadowing her considerable achievements in diplomacy, governance, and military strategy. It is easy to forget that Cleopatra was not only the last pharaoh of Egypt, but also a learned scholar, fluent in several languages, and an astute leader who worked tirelessly to keep Egypt independent in the face of the growing Roman Empire. The modern myth of Cleopatra is that of a woman who achieved power through beauty and romantic relationships, but the real Cleopatra used her intellect, political acumen, and knowledge of the world to carve out a position of power that ultimately ensured her place in history. The portrayal of Cleopatra is not unique in its romanticizing of powerful women in ancient Egypt. Nefertiti, for example, is often depicted as the epitome of feminine beauty and grace, largely because of the famous bust that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. While her beauty is undeniable, Nefertiti's legacy extends far beyond her physical appearance. As the great royal wife of Akhenaten and the mother of 5 daughters, Nefertiti played a central role in the religious revolution initiated by her husband, which sought to replace Egypt's traditional polytheistic beliefs with the worship of the sun god Aten. Nefertiti was not merely a passive observer of her husband's reforms, but an active participant in the religious and political changes that reshaped Egypt during the Amarna period. Some scholars believe she may have briefly ruled as pharaoh after Akhenaten's death, under the name Smenkhkare, though her reign remains shrouded in mystery. In modern depictions, however, Nefertiti is often reduced to a symbol of beauty, with little attention paid to her powerful role in Egypt's history. Similarly, Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, has been overshadowed by her male counterparts in modern portrayals of ancient Egyptian history. While she ruled for over 2 decades, building monumental structures and leading successful trade expeditions, her legacy was actively erased after her death by her stepson, Thutmose III, who sought to erase her name from the historical record. In modern depictions, Hatshepsut is often overlooked in favor of more familiar male pharaohs like Ramses II. However, recent scholarship and archaeological discoveries have brought Hatshepsut back into the public consciousness. Today, she is increasingly recognized not just as a powerful female ruler, but as one of Egypt's most capable and innovative pharaohs. These examples of Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut highlight a recurring pattern in the way that powerful women in ancient Egypt have been both mythologized and marginalized in modern culture. While their images have been adapted to fit certain narratives, whether as beautiful queens, seductive temptresses, or silent symbols of strength, their real power and contributions have often been overshadowed by the dominant male figures of history. This pattern is not just a result of historical erasure, it is a reflection of how gender roles have shaped the way we view power and leadership in the ancient world. The romanticized depictions of these queens in literature and film also reflect larger societal attitudes toward gender and power. Historically, powerful women have often been portrayed through the lens of their relationships with men, and their contributions have been minimized or ignored. This reflects the broader cultural tendency to view women as secondary figures in the political and social arenas. The portrayal of Cleopatra, for example, as a seductress rather than a shrewd political leader, is a reflection of how femininity has often been linked to beauty and sexuality rather than intellect and governance. This portrayal shapes modern perceptions of women in power, reinforcing the idea that women's political and leadership roles are secondary to their relationships with men. Yet, despite these oversimplified portrayals, the lasting impact of ancient Egyptian women's legacies cannot be denied. The fascination with Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut speaks to a deeper cultural yearning for strong, charismatic female figures who defy traditional gender roles. These women continue to captivate the modern imagination because their stories offer an alternative narrative to the traditional, male-dominated power structures that have dominated history. The modern reinterpretation of these figures, especially in feminist readings of history, allows us to understand that power, leadership, and influence are not confined to one gender. The continued interest in these women in art, literature, and film speaks to a broader cultural desire to reclaim their voices and stories. As modern audiences begin to recognize the real contributions of women like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut, the portrayal of these figures is becoming more nuanced. These women are no longer just symbols of beauty or romantic intrigue. They are complex figures who navigated political, social, and religious systems to achieve and maintain power. By acknowledging their true legacies, we not only gain a more accurate understanding of ancient Egypt, but also gain insight into the ways in which women's stories have been silenced, mythologized, or forgotten throughout history. This exploration of how ancient Egyptian women's legacies have been shaped by modern depictions sets the stage for Section 9.2, where we will turn our focus to the modern feminist movements that have drawn inspiration from these historical figures. We will look at how the stories of Cleopatra, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, and others continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of gender, power, and leadership. Their influence can be seen in the ways modern women are challenging traditional power structures and reclaiming their agency, making these ancient queens not just figures of the past, but lasting symbols of resistance, resilience, and empowerment. Ancient Egypt's queens may have lived millennia ago, but their legacies are alive today, shaping the battles for gender equality. How are modern women reclaiming the stories of their ancestors? The resilience, leadership, and agency of the women of ancient Egypt, figures like Cleopatra, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, and Ta, have not only endured in history, but have also become powerful symbols in the modern feminist movement. As contemporary society continues to grapple with issues of gender equality and leadership, the stories of these ancient women are being reclaimed and celebrated as sources of empowerment. Their legacies have transcended time, offering modern women both inspiration and a model for resistance, strength, and resilience. Throughout history, the achievements of women in positions of power, particularly in ancient civilizations like Egypt, have often been overshadowed by patriarchal narratives. However, in recent decades, as modern feminism has grown in strength and influence, there has been a concerted effort to reframe and elevate the roles women have played in shaping history. Ancient Egypt, with its rich tapestry of queens and priestesses, offers a unique lens through which we can understand not only the history of women's power, but also the ways in which their stories resonate with contemporary struggles for gender equality. These women, despite the historical erasure they faced, provide a compelling example of how women can assert leadership and agency, even in societies that sought to constrain them. In modern feminist discourse, the resilience of ancient Egyptian women is often invoked as a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. Take Cleopatra, for example, whose intelligence, political acumen, and ability to navigate the complex world of Roman politics have made her an enduring figure of female power. However, the historical narrative surrounding Cleopatra has often focused on her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, obscuring her true political achievements. Today, Cleopatra is increasingly viewed as a symbol of female leadership, someone who used her intellect and political savvy to secure Egypt's place in the world. This reimagining of Cleopatra as a powerful and strategic ruler, rather than merely a seductress, aligns with the modern feminist movement's emphasis on recognizing the full complexity of women's roles in history, especially when it comes to leadership. Similarly, Hatshepsut, who reigned as pharaoh for over 2 decades, is now being celebrated not just as a female ruler, but as one of Egypt's most successful and innovative pharaohs. Her decision to take on the full regalia of a king and adopt a male identity in order to assert her authority was a radical act of defiance against societal expectations. In the context of modern feminism, Hatshepsut has become a symbol of women breaking through barriers and challenging traditional gender roles. Her legacy as a leader who achieved monumental success in both diplomacy and architecture has inspired contemporary conversations about women in power and the challenges they face in male-dominated fields. The empowerment of ancient Egyptian women is not only a topic of historical reflection, but also one of practical inspiration. Modern feminist movements, especially those advocating for women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa, draw on the strength of these ancient queens to bolster their calls for gender equality and leadership. The image of a woman like Nefertiti, whose beauty and influence transcend her historical context, serves as a reminder that women have always had the capacity for greatness, even in times when they were not granted formal authority. Nefertiti's role as a co-ruler with Akhenaten, and her potential role as pharaoh in her own right, reflects the capacity for women to govern, lead, and influence the course of history. Today, feminist movements across the globe, especially in regions that have experienced political and social upheaval, look to Nefertiti and other powerful women of ancient Egypt as exemplars of leadership in the face of systemic oppression. These ancient figures also resonate with modern women in Egypt and the broader Arab world, who continue to fight for equality in political, economic, and social spheres. In contemporary Egypt, women are actively engaged in challenging gender-based discrimination and fighting for greater representation in government and society. Figures like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut have become cultural icons for Egyptian women, symbolizing not just beauty or royalty, but the possibility of female empowerment in positions of power. In a society where traditional gender roles still exert a strong influence, the rediscovery of these ancient queens serves as a rallying cry for modern women striving to make their voices heard. The link between ancient Egyptian women and their modern descendants is not just one of symbolic power, but also one of tangible inspiration. For many women today, the legacies of Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and Hatshepsut serve as a reminder that women have the ability to lead, challenge authority, and reshape societies. As contemporary Egyptian women continue to fight for greater access to education, healthcare, and political representation, they can look to the powerful women of their past for guidance. These women's stories offer proof that leadership is not confined to men, and that female strength, intelligence, and resilience have always been integral to the survival and success of societies. In addition to providing inspiration for women fighting for rights and equality, the rediscovery of ancient Egyptian women's legacies has also influenced modern global conversations about feminism. These women, who were able to assert their power in a patriarchal society, serve as exemplars of what is possible when women refuse to be confined by societal constraints. Their stories show that leadership, influence, and agency are not the sole domain of men, but can be wielded by women who challenge the systems that seek to suppress them. The modern feminist movement, which seeks to deconstruct patriarchal power structures and create spaces for women to thrive, draws on these examples of historical resilience to fuel its fight for justice and equality. This connection between the ancient past and the present is a vital part of understanding the long-standing struggle for gender equality. By recognizing the power and agency of women in ancient Egypt, we are not only uncovering forgotten histories, but also actively participating in the ongoing struggle to create a world where women's voices are heard, valued, and respected. The legacies of Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and others continue to resonate because their stories remind us that women have always been central to the development of society, even if their contributions have been overlooked. As we continue to explore how the legacy of ancient Egyptian women has influenced modern feminism, we will turn to the ways in which their stories are preserved and celebrated today through literature, art, and pop culture. These figures are not relics of the past. They continue to shape the way we understand power, gender, and leadership in the modern world. Their stories live on in the hearts and minds of contemporary women who, inspired by the resilience and strength of their ancient predecessors, continue to fight for equality and the right to shape their own destinies. This section naturally leads into Chapter 10, where we will reflect on the lasting impact of ancient Egyptian women's lives and how the rediscovery of their stories continues to inform and shape modern perspectives on gender, power, and legacy. We will explore how their influence, both direct and indirect, is a reminder of the ongoing journey to recognize and honor the contributions of women throughout history. What if we told you that the power of ancient Egypt wasn't just in its monuments and pyramids, but in the lives of the women who built, governed, and transformed it? The echoes of their lives still shape the world today. Are you ready to hear their untold story? Throughout this journey, we've uncovered the remarkable and often overlooked stories of the women who played pivotal roles in ancient Egypt's grandeur: queens, priestesses, rulers, and mothers. Their power was not always visible, their struggles often silenced, but their influence rippled through every facet of Egyptian society, from politics and religion to the social and familial structures that held the kingdom together. The history of ancient Egypt, for all its awe-inspiring monuments and extraordinary accomplishments, has long been a history told through the lens of male pharaohs, military conquests, and dynastic power. But what we've discovered over the course of this exploration is that the untold stories of women are not just footnotes to the grandeur of Egypt. They are integral to understanding the civilization's true power. The queens, priestesses, and everyday women who navigated the intricate webs of politics, spirituality, and family life shaped Egypt in ways that have often been overlooked, erased, or distorted by history. Yet their legacies, though silenced for centuries, continue to echo through time, urging us to rethink not only Egypt's past, but also the narratives that have shaped our perceptions of women and power throughout history. From the quiet but formidable influence of women like Ta, who guided Egypt's foreign policy and diplomacy during Amenhotep III's reign, to the bold rule of Hatshepsut, who broke through the gender barriers of kingship, the women of ancient Egypt have left an indelible mark on the civilization's story. They wielded power not through brute force, but through intellect, resilience, and strategic alliances. Cleopatra, whose name has become synonymous with seduction, was in fact one of history's most brilliant rulers, a woman who used her intelligence and political acumen to navigate the complex geopolitics of her time. And Nefertiti, often reduced to a symbol of beauty, was not just a passive consort. She was an active player in one of the most radical religious shifts in Egypt's history. Yet despite their immense contributions, these women have often been obscured, minimized, or even erased. In many cases, their achievements were overshadowed by the pharaohs or male figures who dominated the historical narrative. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced by her successor, Thutmose III, who sought to erase her name from Egypt's record. Cleopatra's political genius was buried beneath the romanticized myths surrounding her relationships with Roman generals. Even Ta, whose diplomatic correspondence reveals her as a key player in Egypt's foreign relations, was relegated to the sidelines in much of Egyptology's early scholarship. These women, whose actions shaped the course of Egypt's history, were made invisible, and their power was muted by those who sought to maintain the status quo. But as modern scholarship progresses, these forgotten figures are beginning to re-emerge. Archaeological discoveries, new interpretations of ancient texts, and a growing recognition of the need for a more inclusive history are allowing us to uncover the lives of women who were once sidelined or hidden. These rediscoveries are not just about correcting the historical record, they are reshaping our understanding of power, gender, and leadership in the ancient world. They challenge the traditional male-dominated narratives and open the door for a more nuanced, complex view of history, one in which women are recognized not just for their beauty or their roles as wives and mothers, but for their political, religious, and intellectual contributions. This journey through ancient Egypt has shown us that power is not solely defined by the traditional symbols of kingship, military might, or dynastic succession. Power can be wielded in subtler, quieter ways through diplomacy, strategy, and the careful navigation of social and political structures. The women of Egypt, despite the barriers they faced, carved out spaces of influence that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. They were not mere symbols of feminine virtues or passive supporters of male rulers. They were rulers in their own right, strategists, diplomats, and religious leaders who shaped the culture, governance, and spiritual life of ancient Egypt. As we've learned throughout this documentary, the historical erasure of these women was not an accident but a deliberate act. Patriarchal forces, both within ancient Egypt and in the centuries following its fall, sought to minimize the role of women in the story of Egypt's rise and fall. This erasure was not just a matter of neglecting their roles, it was an active suppression of women's power and influence. This marginalization, however, did not mean that their legacies disappeared. Instead, these women's stories have persisted, often whispered in the margins of history, waiting to be rediscovered. One of the most significant implications of recovering these stories is the way it alters our perception of gender and power. The women of ancient Egypt were able to exert influence in ways that were unconventional for their time. In a world that expected them to conform to rigid gender roles, they navigated these constraints to build lasting legacies. Their ability to hold power, often without the explicit title or authority granted to their male counterparts, challenges our understanding of what true leadership can look like. The women of Egypt demonstrate that power can be exercised in myriad ways, not just through command and conquest, but through diplomacy, intellect, and resilience. These women remind us that leadership is not confined to one gender, one race, or one form of authority. This re-examination of women's roles in ancient Egypt has profound implications for how we view women's roles in the world today. The ongoing struggle for gender equality, both in the modern world and in Egypt itself, finds its roots in the resilience of these ancient figures. Just as Cleopatra fought to maintain Egypt's independence in the face of Roman imperialism, women today continue to fight for political representation and autonomy in societies that have long relegated them to secondary roles. The struggles of modern women, especially in patriarchal societies, are mirrored in the battles faced by their ancient ancestors. And the legacies of women like Ta, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti serve as powerful reminders that women have always been at the heart of political, social, and cultural change. Today, in Egypt and around the world, women continue to break barriers and challenge the structures of power that seek to confine them. Egyptian women, like those in other parts of the world, are actively pushing for greater representation, rights, and freedoms. The lessons from their ancient predecessors are evident in these modern struggles, as women channel the strength and resilience of their foremothers to continue the fight for equality. Whether in the political arena, the workplace, or the family, the spirit of these ancient queens lives on in the women who are pushing for a more just and equal world. As we bring this documentary to a close, we urge you to reflect on the untold stories of ancient Egypt's women and the ongoing efforts to recover and honor their legacies. The journey of rediscovery is far from over. Scholars and archaeologists continue to unearth new evidence, reinterpret old texts, and challenge traditional narratives. As we continue to uncover the truth about these women and their power, we gain not only a deeper understanding of ancient Egypt, but also of the enduring relevance of their stories in today's world. The impact of these women, though long hidden, is undeniable. They shaped Egypt, challenged the systems around them, and left a legacy that continues to inspire modern conversations about leadership, power, and gender equality. Their stories remind us that, throughout history, women have fought for their voices to be heard, for their power to be recognized, and for their contributions to be acknowledged. In rediscovering these women, we not only reclaim their place in history, but also affirm the ongoing fight for equality, justice, and empowerment. The legacy of ancient Egyptian women is not just a part of the past, it is alive today, shaping the future. History may have tried to bury these stories, but now the sands of time are shifting. The power of these women is no longer hidden, and neither is the legacy they left behind. What will we do with the knowledge we've uncovered? Over the course of this journey, we've explored the untold stories of ancient Egyptian women, unveiling the quiet strength, resilience, and influence they had in shaping one of the world's most remarkable civilizations. From the political acumen of Cleopatra and Ta to the bold leadership of Hatshepsut, we've seen how these women, whether as rulers, priests, or mothers, were not mere footnotes in history, but central figures who helped create and maintain Egypt's legacy. We've also uncovered the harsh reality of how these women's contributions were minimized, erased, or distorted by history. Through deliberate acts of suppression, much of what they achieved was obscured by later patriarchal powers, whether through the defacement of monuments, the rewriting of historical records, or the relegation of their legacies to the margins of the past. Yet, despite these efforts, their stories have not been completely buried. Thanks to the ongoing work of historians, archaeologists, and scholars, we are slowly piecing together the fragmented accounts of these remarkable women. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes. The women of ancient Egypt were not passive figures, but powerful agents of change whose influence spanned politics, religion, and society. What we've learned through this documentary is not just about a long-gone civilization. It's about a broader, universal truth, one that transcends time and place. It's about how women throughout history have fought for recognition, agency, and power, often in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about how the voices of these women, though silenced in the historical narrative, continue to inspire and resonate in the modern struggles for gender equality, justice, and leadership. As we close, we leave you with a call to action. The knowledge we've uncovered in this documentary should not remain confined to the past. It should spark curiosity, further exploration, and a deeper questioning of the narratives that have long shaped our understanding of history. The legacies of ancient Egyptian women who fought for recognition, who led, who shaped their world continue to have profound relevance today. We must remember their contributions, not just as relics of a distant past, but as inspirations for the challenges we face in our own time. So, what will we do with the knowledge we've uncovered? We can start by continuing to dig deeper, by reading more, researching further, and questioning the historical narratives we've inherited. Share the stories of these women, Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, Tiye, and the many others who have been overlooked, for they are not just historical figures, but beacons of strength and resilience. Let their legacies live on through our curiosity, our conversations, and our actions. The power of these women is no longer hidden, it's alive and waiting to be discovered. What's next is up to us. Let's carry their stories forward.